All right, welcome everybody. This is episode 8 of What Makes It Tick. Our biggest objections to cloud productions. What are the biggest objections to cloud productions? And then what are the secrets to dealing with those objections? So I have a short list, but what I was hoping that we would end up with is plenty of people here that can also add on to this list, and then us just kind of brainstorm collectively to see what we could do to help make those objections go away and the best way to handle us with those. So from the top of my list, and I kind of compiled a couple of different lists and other people on the Discords kind of getting some ideas too. Number one, what about latency? So where do you measure latency? So let's start from there. Are we talking acquisition to distribution? Are we talking just from the operator standpoint, the person operating the cloud infrastructure or whatever that happens to be away? Or are we talking about from the viewer standpoint? Given that I've spent the last 10 plus years of my life in the dealing with low latency, or what they called low latency, from a gaming side, that's where I have a lot of my knowledge from. And then we moved into the pandemic, and then it all changed because what I thought was low latency in the past was nothing whenever you compare it to what we're doing here just right now on Zoom. And it's amazing that people don't get that it's still a thing that they think all streaming should be just as fast now is the way I look at it. So it's like, well, it should be just like Zoom, right? But it's not. There's something that comes with latency when the distribution side is that, of course, you get more latency, but you also get more reliability usually. And that's an important thing to some of the stakeholders. So from the viewer standpoint, how much is too much, I guess? And then how much is just enough without being too much? So I've definitely watched some sports over the years. So in the viewer standpoint, is 2 minutes too much? Are we getting nowadays, we're getting the Twitters, we're getting or the X's messages already. It's like, I can't believe he missed that goal, or those kind of things. At that point, it creates a disjointed delivery, right? So the people that are watching are disjointed, they're parts. I think back of a story I heard of a guy in an apartment building, like it was like Brooklyn or something like that, and they all had different timings of what was happening in the game. They're all watching, most of them are all watching the game, and they could hear like cheers starting over here or boos starting over there, and then it would just trickle in. It goes, oh, that play happened. So then it happens in real time like that, but you don't know it. If you don't know what happens over there, you don't know if you're any different. And that's kind of where I've always looked at it from the standpoint of streaming latency is, what does it matter? You can't see what's happening anyway. Now, in my gaming world that I was in, it did matter because they wanted to make sure that there wasn't somebody sitting on the side. They called them sideliners. They wanted to make sure that there wasn't somebody sitting on the side and executing bets. So for the gaming world, it was a very, very big thing to keep latency to a very, very small minimum as much as possible. Now, that's not always entirely possible, but it was a goal of keeping me and making sure that that latency is as small as possible. So we're talking about the viewer standpoint. Welcome, Jonas, Guy, Tucker. Thanks for coming in. So from an operator standpoint, let's talk about the latency from that point. But first, let's rewind a little bit. So from the viewer standpoint, when is it too much latency? Everybody go around. Let's go around. We'll start with Greg on the top corner for me. Greg, where's too much latency that you have clients that you're delivering to are saying, why is this so slow?
Well, in the really old days, the networks could produce sports, like I remember being at Daytona and having local net return out of Orlando or Daytona that we could see in the truck. So I'm looking at cameras that are absolutely real time because they're analog back then, and looking at what comes back off of the off air, and we were well within 10 seconds back then. because, analog's just fast, and then DirecTV came in, and then all of a sudden, it's like, 45 seconds to 2 minutes between the time something happened in the truck and it went off to New York, and then they popped it up to DirecTV, who took it down in Colorado, and then I guess the encoding decoding added quite a bit of lag to it, and so we're like looking at least a minute.
Right.
So net return off of DirecTV was very disappointing for us in the business. But people at home, I mean, like you said, unless the neighbors were watching off the antenna and you were watching off your, DirecTV dish or, Dish Network or whoever you had, and then you'd hear everybody cheer next door and then like, wow, I wonder what's going on. And then a minute later, see the play. So but again, if you're just watching one source, I don't think latency to the viewer means anything outside of maybe the gaming betting that you mentioned. Because if you don't have any reference, like you heard the people
Right.
across the way, right? So you have a reference that, hey, something happened. I just don't know what it is yet. But without that, how do you know? I mean, you're
Sure.
totally disconnected, and this is your only reference is what you're watching. I think at that point, latency doesn't make any difference at all. But you're going to get to this in a second. And we talked about this before everybody showed up. But one of the things that I fight with when I do my corporate, fly pack kind of stuff is latency in the room. We're shooting cameras of people behind a, lectern giving their presentation, and there are big screens, behind them on the stage or whatever.
Yeah.
And we do IMAG with the people quite frequently, and when, you see the guy live do this, and then a second or two later you see him do it again on the screen, and when you're listening to the sound and you're looking at his mouth, because you can't really tell his mouth, if you're 200 feet back in the back of the room, you can't really see his lips too well, but you do on the big screen, especially if we're looking at a head and shoulder shot.
Right.
But you hear him coming out of the PA and the lips don't match. It looks like some kind of a B-grade Godzilla movie. So those are things that drive clients nuts, which eventually come back around to me. Hey, what's that all about?
Right. Right. And
So,
then, and that's a big part of it. IMAG latency, that's a whole nother world in itself.
so- and we're
And
still
it
needing
gets
to do
different colors.
hybrids. So as we were
Right.
discussing before the show, I mean, one of the things that we're working on is, can I put my iron in the room? Can I put my Ross Carbonite there so that we can feed monitors, the camera go right through, you got 1 frame, 2 frames maybe, and then it's up to the LED guys after that. But that minimizes the screen latency as much as possible. But, maybe we don't want everybody on site. Maybe there's, budget concerns for the client and stuff. So we
Sure.
still need a way to control that box from here or elsewhere or whatever. And that's not necessarily a full-on cloud solution, but it's still remote access.
It's across the cloud. Let me put it that way. All right, Jonas, what about you? Where's the pain point for latency?
Ah, nobody cares.
You think
It's
so?
like, well, people think they care. The client only cares if they look at only the YouTube feed. But like often someone complaining about latency is a highlight of another issue that isn't really latency. Like when the client complains about it, it's probably that they don't have a low latency multi-viewer or program
True.
out that they can see, and they get super frustrated because like I just called for that. Why isn't it here yet? Why I'm watching on YouTube and you guys aren't listening to me? You're super slow. Um, the one time where audiences matter for like super participant oriented stuff. I think if you're below 200, 500 people and you have interaction, then that's where it matters because you have not enough chat messages and interaction that there's no like tie-in anymore. Like
Right.
Twitch, for example, there it still matters a lot, but like for most of the shows we do, it doesn't matter. But also most of them happen to either be like within 30 seconds with YouTube or within a second with Zoom. And it's interesting, we had one client that was betting type ish that had like, I think it was 10 seconds was the whole window from when it happened to when it was gone. And for them, it was just how quick, like the time frame, how long people can place their bet after revealing the cards.
So in those applications, they were again, like, kind of goes back to where I was in the tennis world, was making sure that the bettors or the sideliners, as we called them, they weren't making bets before the people that could make bets.
It's more data, I think, in like the development world. We call it the data versus video latency, because like data is really quick. Like it's
Right.
hard to have a longer delay than like a second, maybe three. Although most people don't even know how to delay data. So like that's where you get into a lot of issues if you have data feeds, like a chat feed, a Q&A feed.
Right.
We saw it on Mukana just the last couple bit, where like as soon as the host is done with reading it, the chatbot posts it into the chat, but you're still waiting 30 seconds till you see it in the YouTube. So like that's when I think that's the same way that Greg said it. Like that's the online's version of IMAC issue. If you have a
Right.
data feed,
True.
and
True.
that
True.
might,
No, I
and
agree.
for betting, like for betting, it's like, oh, your bet resolved. Like that's why like now a lot of bet companies saying like, hey, the problem isn't really like that you could bet too early or too late or like all that, but the amount of time while you can bet is lower
Right.
if you have a long latency, and it's really hard to delay those data feeds. So at that point, you might see, oh, it is resolved. You won $1,000, and you're like, well, the play didn't even happen. So those
Right.
are the kind of
Yeah.
scenarios that I see. But that's like basically IMAC latency for online, like
True.
data versus video feed latency. That's the IMAC of
No. And we
my
were fighting the
existence.
exact same thing ourselves because we
Yeah.
had scoring data that was going out. And then at the same time, they were seeing the video, and they were doing some fancy stuff to delay that and try to get it in sync. But the primary goal was to get the scoring data as fast as possible to keep the sideliners from going, hey, he just did an ace. Okay, so do go ahead, go ahead, go ahead. And that was a thing. And we had to spot them. We were responsible for being part of that. Tim, I know you do a little bit different type of broadcasting than sports necessarily, even though it happens on a field. But in your streaming world, what do you find? What is acceptable to your clientele for latency, or do you even get questions about it?
I get no questions about it. I mean, we're most of our events have anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 viewers, and I think we've never had a question about it, not once. We like more latency because we just need the stream to be more stable. So we add as much as possible, and we're probably sitting in, I want to say 30 to 45 seconds of delivery at that point.
And really, honestly, that's not that long. I mean, we might think it's that long if we're talking about what we're doing here with WebRTC and Zoom and things that are super fast. It seems like it's long, 30 to 40 seconds. But I mean, I remember way back in the day, it's like Greg was saying too, it's like my broadcasts that are going to the world feed. By the time we see them, it's almost 2 minutes. To this day, it's almost 2 minutes behind, because it's going all the way to the BT tower over IP, then it's hitting a bird, and then it's coming down off the bird to Tennis Channel on the other side of the US, and then it's going back to DirecTV for me to be able to monitor it. I mean, it's excruciating long to go, okay, so what are they talking about? We can't even listen because it's so far disjointed. So we just give them, it's a world feed. So we just got to give them the storylines that we want them to talk about. And we keep showing that same girl over and over until they realize that that's, his wife or whatever, or girlfriend or mistress or whatever happens to be. All right. So from the operator standpoint, then let's talk about cloud production, latency, and the operator standpoint. That's a sticky point to a lot of people that are trying to get into cloud production. I think that's one of the questions many times people come up with. So in my measurements, it's milliseconds, literally. I don't find it as something that's even seconds that I have to deal with in multi-viewers or control surfaces or control interfaces on being able to operate a cloud infrastructure. Jonas, would you say you're similar and around the same?
I would say like up to 100 milliseconds is what most operators can deal with. It's funny, like we fight. I do a lot of WebRTC stuff right now, and like we fight for every millisecond and trying to optimize it. And then you realize that the freaking rendering pipeline of the GPU takes like 30 milliseconds to
Right.
render it from when the frame arrives, and you're like, oh, great. Or like the NDI output of vMix takes X amount, and you can't like
Sure.
get that.
And there's no way to get around it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have actually, for a lot of producers, we now added DVL feeds, so they can play back and like go back in time, and they're way more happy with that than having like live things, because they often have to manage a bunch of things. It's interesting, but yeah, with the Nimble WebRTC and Cloudflare Stream WebRTC, we're generally below 100, worst case 150, sometimes 200, depending on location. I also have to admit, being in Germany and doing mostly US productions, I like the last 2 years, just my brain is now rewired to like, it's fine, this little hiccup, this little latency. But I still have colleagues who drives it crazy, and they're on the South Coast, and like we have on the West Coast the infrastructure. I'm like, really? I can't even tell, but for them it's still a big difference. For me, it's like 30 more milliseconds to the 100 milliseconds that it takes already.
Because what they're used to on-prem, or do you think it's just because of
No, it's just because they're used like if you're accustomed to way less latency, it's just like, oh, now I like 30 to 60 feels like now you double the latency,
sure.
but 120 to 150 doesn't matter that much anymore. I also have seen a lot of great TDs. I think that's like one of the things that like great TDs are really good at. They get the rhythm of your multi-viewing in. Like then consistent latency is super important to me as well. Like I want to have my TD know that they press a button, there's like the latency from till it hits the feed, till they see it in the multi-view, because they like we work with some great TDs that just like every single time spot on, even with the latency, because they just get into the rhythm, into the groove of it, and like it's beautiful seeing a
It's a muscle
great
memory
TD.
also. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a muscle memory of how many times you do it, and then also
And that's
knowing
where the
sport.
consistent latency, like if I build a setup, it's like 100% about deterministic controls and consistency. Because like we have these awesome operators and they're great, and their body is trained to something specific, and I need to give their body the same input for everything, so they can just operate the best and don't have to spend cycles on, oh, now it feels like we're a little later again. So yeah, that's mostly what it is for us.
So I guess what's the answer then for the question from the operator standpoint? Be below 100 milliseconds if at all possible. Is that where that's
Yeah.
what we're saying? So somebody asks, it's like, well, what about the latency if I'm controlling that cloud infrastructure? It's like, well, it's under 100 milliseconds. Is that
Yeah.
too
I
slow?
mean, how long does it take if you have your Blackmagic 8K and you need to convert the SDI to HDMI, and then you cheaped out on the monitor, and the monitor is latent, and there's an up conversion somewhere in there, and
Have you ever measured all that too? Right?
yeah,
About
like
how long,
that's why I
right?
say 100 milliseconds. It's not that far off what we have from a click to photon latency of current gen systems.
Sure.
Like there's just
Especially
not that
systems that are
much
doing
latency.
signal conversion
Yep.
inside or frame syncing
And
inside.
especially Blackmagic systems.
Sure. Don't get us started. All right. So acquisition to distribution, how fast is fast enough? So that it's really kind of what we talked about really on the viewer standpoint. So say a minute's a little bit too far, but a half a minute, 30 seconds or so is probably pretty acceptable. 20 to 30 seconds. I guess it's because people are used to YouTube and
Yeah.
that seems to be kind of where they're living. For those events that we're doing and sending out to YouTube or Facebook, even really is about the closest on that too. So that's kind of where we're talking about on the latency side, and we could do a whole show on latency. I know because that's a sticky situation. But we're going to keep going. So other objections to cloud production. I heard cloud was really expensive. So what is a factor of really expensive, right? So for us, is really expensive applying to that 1 hour that you're using it, or is really expensive applying to the 1 month that you're booking time for that machine running 24/7? At that point, yes, it can be more expensive, but it's not really expensive compared to what we've had to do in the past. Build out an MCR, rent a building, build out all this infrastructure, and then at that time, finally get on the air months, years later.
With my clients, I mostly explain it that it is still like going into the cloud to save money is the wrong intention. You can still save a lot of money by going to cloud, but you spend money in other categories and it's other costs. Like if we break down how a traditional production works, you have to rent or buy gear and all that. You have upkeep. If you buy a building, you have upkeep to that. One of the lovely things that we do with cloud is our company can scale down from 1 production a month to like 200 productions a month. And yes, we will spend a heck ton more of money on AWS. But the great thing with cloud is your expenses are way more targeted to your income. Like it's really hard for me to find a cost category like maybe our Zoom account, a little bit of holding resting costs on AWS, but most of our expenses are tied to cloud, and then like travel rates. That's the other thing. If you pay full day travel rates and you don't have 2 days of travel, that's your biggest money saver. And
True.
I just had the experience that you can get great people for 2 days that normally would say, you know what, I need to travel there a day, travel back a day. It's not worth it. And for cloud, they're like, oh yeah, sure, I'll jump on. I'll remote it. So it's like you get a better quality in tech is what we've seen a lot of times. And you save the travel rate. But your expenses really just shift in category.
Right.
Like it's
You
the
just
whole
move from this
OpEx
column to
versus
that column.
CapEx.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
like it's a whole thing of like OpEx is way more easy to say this is billable to the client. I can bill that
Sure.
through, which at that point, is it really a cost if you can bill it through to your client?
Right.
Versus like if you have upkeep and yeah.
No, great points. Great points. And I feel like that's still something being worked out too, because some people do feel like that they could just jump in and do everything in the cloud, and some people preach that. And at some point there are certain things you shouldn't. If you're going to be running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it's probably not going to be that most cost effective to do it unless it's a data service or something like that that's not as bandwidth intensive and everything. So then that brings us to our next question. How much does all that bandwidth cost in the cloud? So most people don't understand it unless they're those of us that are in it. Bandwidth going up doesn't cost you hardly anything because it's just the ground, the whatever your first mile is, whatever that cost is, but you're probably going to have that internet anyway. But then on the same side, there are things to consider on the bandwidth out. And that's just a careful manipulation of those numbers. So the bandwidth out would be not only distribution, so your endpoints that you're going to, but you can't forget about those multi-viewers and how happy everybody wants to have their own and how many of those are going out there. I found that whenever I was using Dolby IO as my multi-viewer CDN, is I couldn't believe how much bandwidth we were chewing through at that point until I got the bill. And then I found out. So those are things we have to think about on the bandwidth cost. It's minimal, I would say. Minimal, but still has to be managed.
I would say it depends. Like a lot of people are still like the whole issue with bandwidth I see is like it's stock versus flow pricing, where we like you don't pay for 10 megabits of connectivity, you pay for X amount of data usage. So we have on our prices, we have calculated it through 10 hours of streaming. One thing that a lot of people don't calculate is if you're feeding a lot of Zoom machines and sending Zoom feeds, that's also about 6 Mbits per Zoom machine feeding out to the Zoom reflector. A lot of people don't keep those in mind. They only keep the streaming one in mind.
You're absolutely right. Honestly, that is a big number. That has caught me at times. When I had 100 Zoom machines for a Tony Robbins event, that was like, well, the bandwidth, I mean, I covered it. I knew to go way above it, but that is a number that you don't always think about. If you have 12 different bots running to bring people in and out as guests for corporate events, for instance, those are the cost.
And if I teach people on how to do cloud production, I tell them go to the Haivision site, take their bandwidth calculator, type in 10 hours of streaming. Oh, but we're going live 1 hour. I'm like, no, you take 10 hours. As long as you're there, you're going to be streaming a test or something.
Yep.
Don't cheap out on tests. It's not worth anything if you cheap out on the tests. Put that in, increase the number by 20 to 25%, put that into AWS calculator, and you're done. Build that through to your client. We have not had an issue with that. I think some people, I've had a couple of clients who just bill like 10% above instance cost to the client. I'm like, that's not enough. Like now you need to nickel and dime people. That's not enough to catch the oh by the ways and hey, can you like also send that soon to somewhere like. But
well,
like
we
you
want to
said,
do a test all day the day before. That's
it's funny though, because like AWS bandwidth is really, really expensive. It's one of the most expensive in the industry. Especially if you stream to South Korea. Don't do that. That's no fun. But like at the same time, it's still relatively cheap.
Right.
Like a terabyte costs you what, like $20 or something.
Yeah. In the scheme of things, it's cheap, but they are more expensive than the other offerings.
And that's where like you said, Dolby IO or something, sometimes it makes sense to go to a provider that has the flow pricing where you can say, I need 5 gigabit connectivity, put my server there, and I just bounce all my WebRTC off that. That's how I handle high like throughput stuff. But yeah, AWS, it's not that expensive.
And then you're talking about also bandwidth wise, you're talking about on the CDN side, Dolby IO, just great, it's fast, but it's really expensive. If you think AWS is expensive, if you're trying to do distribution off of Dolby IO, it is really expensive. So
I mean,
that
look
lower
at
latency
IVS
that
rocks.
they have.
The funniest thing is like the new streaming platform Kick, that is the rival to Twitch, is using IVS under the hook. And of course, they have an enterprise deal. But if you just type in the numbers that they are streaming, and like so many people that I've heard are like, it's the best thing that ever happened to AWS, that like Twitch gets replaced with like streaming over IVS, because like they are making so much money on that bandwidth.
Isn't IVS based off Twitch technology?
Yes.
Pushing even more in. Good to have competition and good to have other ideas, right?
The one thing to keep in mind with bandwidth where it gets really expensive though is if you're bonding and you're on site live with like Sims, the US is crazy expensive for like data. We're still like, compared to Europe, it's like, really? That's what you can get through with? And of course, there's like different things. And then the worst part is if you need to buy a venue internet. That's where like bandwidth really costs you. Hey, I would like 10 Mbits at that hotel. Oh yeah, that's 17,000 per day, please. Thank you.
Well, from the days of your doing some events with New Tech, Lenny pops in. Oh man, I remember seeing a $48,000 line item. $48,000. I couldn't believe it, but they wanted to show
For 4
streaming.
days. 4 days.
Yeah. Hard to believe. But I agree with you, Jonas, as those are things we all have to manage. Is, it's not something not to be careful with and to think about. So next on my list, number 4, how do I deploy this stuff? It seems really complicated. There is no simple answer for this one, for sure. For me, is if you really want to get deep into it, you have to put in the time to learn it. But also at the same time, there are a lot of great people out there like Jonas, like Tucker, like myself that go out, do consultations and do consulting work to help people get a jump on it, get them started. And that, and just our little Discord group here too is been just a phenomenal resource to get people started and getting off. I mean, we've got that old guy. What's his name? Old guy. Gosh, he's been around for a long time. Oh yeah, George. Like George, for instance. Yeah. So I mean, he's doing it. So he's got it going and he's figured it out. And then we even got some older guys that are still holding back a little bit, but you know, he'll get there. He'll get there
Well-
sooner or later. One way or another, Greg's coming along.
I think you answered it well though. Like, and it's funny because the shift, in my mind, the shift is more from hardware-based production to software-based production. Like, I try to explain that software-based production in cloud is really not that different. You just put your setup somewhere
It's
else.
just somebody else's computer in the bottom line,
And
right?
like you said, I mean, the scripts for us have been just amazing because like Chirag and I built those scripts and now we deploy them for clients. And it's like, I know that if Jeff needs 30 instances, they're gonna work because I already deployed 200 for someone else. And that really is like, yeah. And if you have a hardware failure in the cloud, that's the most amazing part is hardware failure in the cloud. You click the little turn it off button, you turn it on again, and you have a brand new machine that's doesn't have any hardware failures anymore. It's like
Well,
I
that
play
brings
the
us-
game with my clients so often. It's my favorite game to play because every client gets there. They start with cloud production, they embrace it, and then about half a year in, I get the call. So Jonas, have you ever thought about building your own cloud? I looked at how much I'm paying AWS, and I would really like to build some servers here. And I'm like, sure. Would you like the same redundancy that AWS has? And then I have a list of items that we go through. Oh, you want diversified paths of networking. You want diversified trunking. Oh, you want cold spares? Because like if one of those goes out and two of those go out, we still need cold spares, right? Well, I guess we can use AWS. That's cheaper.
Okay, so you circled right exactly where I wasn't even trying to steer you, but that was exactly where I was going to next. Are there any failover mechanisms in the cloud? Right. So it's inherently already there for us. We turn it off, we turn it on again, and we should be in another place. We should be in another data center. There's multiple data centers already available. So it's up to us as cloud architects to be able to build that redundancy in and spread out the love so that we make sure that everybody's taken care of. And it all depends too on how much that client is going to be, what their risk, how much risk they're willing to take. But also at the same time, the redundancy, we could go forever and ever and ever redundant. That's not a word, is it? But making more redundancy there than you need just because we can, but we don't necessarily need to. But there is a certain point where we have to just kind of stop. But in the same time, what other failovers besides multiple data centers, besides ingress paths? That's one way of thinking of it, is like having two different paths going up to a certain data center. Then there's also redundancy in multiple cloud providers. So AWS, GCP, Azure, private clouds, whatever they happen to be, other smaller cloud like DigitalOcean and things like that. Where do we draw the line, and how far do we need to go? I guess that's dependent on how much the client wants to pay and how high their pain tolerance is in both that. Wouldn't you say, Jonas?
No one has yet paid enough to use diversified cloud providers because that is really, really expensive. Because like at that point, you need two
Do you mean
teams.
different 2 different
Yeah.
providers.
We've done everything from like, if it goes down, that's fine as long as we have the local records too. Well, you can lose about 5 frames in switching over the CDN. And we've done all of that from like, and what it really comes down to is building clever redundancies where it actually helps and doesn't harm your process. And the cloud is
Sure.
great with that. One thing to keep in mind with that is, since we were talking about bandwidth, if you are using different availability zones to spread within your data center or within a region, that also costs you. Don't try to send those NDI feeds across availability zones, because that's gonna really cost you.
Sure. Yeah,
Um,
and we learned those lessons. We have learned those
we
lessons.
we learned those lessons. But like, we have been, knocking on wood, live every single time there's been a major AWS outage. And it is really about knowing your things. What is your break class account if SSO strikes? AWS has made a lot of improvements to the console, but how can you get an instance up without the console? Try to at least know something about the CLI.
Sure.
What does evacuate actually mean to a region? There's this great concept that Netflix coined of like evacuating a cloud provider or region, where all your workloads get terminated in that region and you need to rebuild it in another region. It's one of the things that we are prepared for most of the times. The good old times of availability issues.
Sure.
You remember those? Those were
Yeah.
scary times. That was
Yeah.
one of the hardest things to explain to a client. Yeah, we can't get instances. That was probably the scariest outage I've ever seen. Apart from that, yeah, the cloud has a lot of redundancies built in. You don't need to worry about power. You don't need to worry about a fiber cut. Your latency might increase. That's one of the issues we've seen with AWS if they have issues. I think solid monitoring and knowing when to evacuate a region is the main great backup that you can have. And evacuating might also mean, how do you transfer that license key from your Sienna processing engine over? How do you transfer your Waves plugins key over? Like, having that in mind, especially, hey, you can't touch that region anymore. Please set up your production in another region. That's like evacuation drills with that one thing where we had the 5 frames of failover. We did with the whole team. Like, literally, we shut down the VPN server in one region. We're like, oops, I guess you need to work in the other region. Yeah.
No, that was definitely one of those things. Talk about availability was one of those that for sure it was like, how do you get around that whenever we're supposed to go live? We completely rebuilt from going on G4s to C5 machines in AWS, and we did not want to do that because we had a workflow that worked, and it was just a necessity at that time. And that was a very scary 3 or 4 days, definitely, because it didn't know.
Yeah.
The client doesn't care. The client was just like, we just hired you to come up with 50 machines. So, or 50 meetings. They don't even think of it as machines, but we want to have 50 meetings. You're supposed to have 50 meetings. We're going to have all these people show up. If you are not up and running, then we've got problems. And
that's
can explain that to them.
And that's where like booting early, like if you price it to end client,
Extra
price it in
day.
a way where you can
Yep.
boot early. For us, it has been great. I wake up, I boot instances before anyone in the US wakes up. It has
Yeah.
been like, that saved us through so many of
That
those
is 100% job security, my friend. Absolutely. Don't move
Yeah.
closer.
shows.
Either that or you
that
lose more
is-
sleep.
I have another client that we set up a script. Don't let him set up scripts to stop instances. I told him that's a no-go for me. But we have scripts that boot everything, and if it fails, he gets a nice email at 6 a.m. that it tried 300 times and still failed, and he knows, well, I better get up and
Figure something out.
evacuate the region.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I've gone so far with a few of our clients to move and basically duplicate everything that they did in say US East 1. We did the same thing in I want to say it was Oregon's data center. So we built exactly the same thing 100%. All we had to do was move licenses at that point. And that was a big, just a method. It never got used, but it was a way of, they're going to still, even for those machines though, they're paying for storage time, they're paying for hard drive space, they're paying for that allocation over there. Even though they're not running, there are some costs involved in doing that, but it was worth it to them to know that that's a backup. I have a backup, because remember there was that one time US East, we, like you said, we couldn't get to the control panel, couldn't start anything unless you knew the back end, and luckily you do.
That's
And-
one of the times where booting early saved us. Like we had all our instances up before that happened. And like our client called us and was like, I heard there's a big AWS outage. We're like, yeah. We're like, live, can you check the CD? And they're like, oh, I guess everything is fine. I'm like,
Yep.
everything is fine.
That's a great thing to be able to say too. So another failover mechanism, we're going to backtrack just a little bit. Failover mechanism would be in the ingest side. Something that I use is I have failover modules within my Sienna processing engine, and you can do similar things, I believe, in the Nimble infrastructure. Is that not right, Jonas? So that if you have
Yeah, you
a
can have
primary and a
multiples,
backup
yes.
feed coming in, it'll automatically flip between
But
those.
I'll admit, both Sienna and Nimble is too automatic for me. Like on shows that I have an engineer on, I want the engineer to be the one who decides what feed is actually better. Because you might have one feed that looks, with the metadata, looks horrible, but it's still better because like the latency is low enough that we can recover the feed and it actually still looks fine, and the other one looks clean, but it's being sent through like an LTE receiver sender duo that just doesn't work.
Right.
So that's what I do most of the time there. One thing we also sometimes do is, if it's a super high level show, you can use AWS's Backbone if you do VPC peerings across regions. Or you can also use the AnyConnect global accelerator is what they call it. Then you have an Anycast IP address that you can use. And that way, the traffic gets routed into AWS's Backbone as soon as possible. And they have pretty good peerings with all the local providers. So that way we are able to route across internet failures across like US, Germany sometimes is an issue, and then we can route across that. And that's where a tool like Cloudflare Radar really helps you understand the landscape. How many attacks are we seeing? Are we seeing a lot of DDoS coming that way? Which not only has effect on that country that's being attacked, but also on all the throughput on the routers from that country to the other one. And then sometimes we can say, hey, you know what? Let's route through Ireland our SRT feeds. And that has been a great redundancy on that point.
That is actually some great points on the redundancy, just and knowing where to do that inside AWS. Also, if you're living in that, it's like there's a lot of tools available that you could use there. So you bring up something that is going to be a great topic. It was number 8 on my list. I'm going to skip the number 7 and I'll come back to it. So it was, well, it's on the internet, isn't it? So anybody can see it. I literally have that question all the time, because they just think, oh, well, it's just our control surfaces are, we're connecting over VPNs. We're sending streams back and forth over, we actually do secure our streams, our WebRTC streams, or multi-viewer streams and things like that. We don't just give links out willy-nilly. And then we have ultimate control to be able to turn them on or off if we want to any given person we're having it out. So I guess that's another thing to address. What was your best way to say a solution to that?
Sad story is a lot of people don't. Like if you really want to have a bad feeling about it in our industry, go to Shodan and type in Bitfocus Companion. Like you get a whole list of just public companion pages, and you can like, I looked at it yesterday again and I was like, I don't know. If you want to sleep even worse, just type in Blackmagic. You will get all the web presenters, all the items that are just public, all that. We use Cloudflare Access in front of a lot of things. The other thing that's really cool if you use AWS's SSO for logging in to your accounts,
Sure.
you can set up the load balancer in front of an instance. Like if you have, let's say, companion interface, you can set up the load balancer and tie that in. We did that for one client. So that way you log in with your AWS SSO and it gives you access to the companion feed just in your browser without the VPN. But most of the time it's Cloudflare access. And it's one of the things with, if you work with Fortune 100, 500 companies, you can't just like willy-nilly stream feeds around. Like I haven't
Yeah,
found
there's
someone who
rules in
like
that too.
mandated SRT to be encrypted yet, because that is a whole other thing. But like, yeah, most of the stuff is HTTPS and at least has some transport level encryption and then making sure it's not just public. The other thing also is temporary access for engineers and technicians.
Being able to
Like,
rotate those controls. Yeah,
being
I
able to
completely
rotate
agree with that.
that.
Yeah.
And also for clients, like if you have a multi-viewer, how do you ensure that if you use the same multi-viewer show 2 days later and the client still has it open, they don't see their competitors' show suddenly being produced?
Well, you bring that up. That's actually something I've been one of my
Yeah.
long-term goals is exactly that, is more of an interface, a platform that would allow me just to send out that one, and then they have their own login, their unique information, so that a way that we have less of that happening. We're not currently big enough to be able to worry about multiple vendors seeing each other or multiple clients seeing each other's content, but they are quite conscious of that. I know in the past that has been something that's like, well, I don't want them to see my show.
Especially if you work with like financial institutes.
Well, there's legal reasons there too.
And
Absolutely.
like, if you, I always say, as soon as you have to show, we call it safe harbor slides, the thing is not indicative of past results and
Right.
please don't sue us, please don't sue us, please don't sue us. As soon as that slide is gone, like just check all your ports, make sure nothing is public, like just tighten it a little up more and make sure everything is there. Not that we don't tighten it up for everyone, but like that's when you know it's really on.
Yeah. Well, I
'Cause then
was shocked.
legal is watching.
Well, yeah, exactly. You don't want that letter coming to you 6 months later, right? Right. We were thinking also earlier this week when Kevin brought up that website and you were talking about it. Kevin and I were having, Kevin McCardle also on the Discord, we're having a conversation this morning about this, and he was like, "Hey, do you know anybody in this area that is using Sienna?" And I was like, "No, it doesn't ring a bell." He goes, "They're wide open." So if we know those ports, we know them. So that was really, I mean, I can't believe it. I can't believe he was wide open and it was exposed. And it was just somebody that did not know what they were doing to secure themselves.
And a lot of people, like, Showdown is a great website because it shows you, I know. Like, I have so many clients who tell me, "Oh, it's just an IP address. Why would anybody go to them?" Like, I know that all of our, like, there's 18 people right now with a Bertok camera that are transmitting MDNS signals if I ping them correctly over Showdown.
Right. Well,
Yes,
you know what hit
there's
me
like a
was
security on it, but like we could technically dial into their NDI.
Sure, sure. And then especially with NDI being a control protocol at that point too, you could move cameras around. Yeah, absolutely. I was actually I've always been one of those, Tucker loves me about it. It's like I turn off the firewalls on the machines and I let the the router do a lot of that NAT transit doing most of the firewall work, but I frequently turn off the firewalls on the machines. I'll admit that. But I've definitely changed my ways of thinking because I opened up my public IPs, which I only had one. I have 5 reserved with my provider with AT&T Fiber, and I opened up all of them and finally got some things working in our router. I turned on one of our virtual machines, and that virtual machine was allocated to a single IP. And then I looked at the logs in that virtual machine that we're seeing all the attempted logins within 2 days, just over the weekend, Saturday and Sunday. I had over 300 times being hit from different IP addresses, and you could tell what was failing. So I could see they were going through the probably the most common list of passwords and usernames, and I was like, holy cow, this does exist. There's no doubt in my mind.
I always say if you think you're not being attacked, your logging is really, really bad.
Hmm.
As someone who has like done web hosting and email hosting in the past, it's like it is crazy the amount of logs that I have of just trying this, trying this, trying this, trying this, trying this. And
I
that's
didn't
why
have that
so-
visibility before until I did those virtual machines on that Proxmox server, and I could not believe how many times we were getting hit. And I was like, okay, so and I was just doing testing on it. I didn't care
Yeah.
about the virtual machine they were trying to get to, but I was like, boy, this was really something. And then it makes me think of like, how many times are they hitting my normal IP address that my Peplink's been running on forever? You know, how many times has that been attacked? Because it
And-
was,
and
I
the big
immediately
worry
turned off.
is when you say I don't care about the machine that they can hit, what you do care about is the things that the machine can hit.
True. Yes.
Like-
yes.
That's a lot of people. Oh yeah, that's just my VM. I'm like, oh, you have a VPN to your home network? They're like, yeah, I need to control it. I'm like, great. So now we
It
have an
goes
open
both
door to
ways.
your yeah.
Very true. Very true. All right. So then last on my list, out of order, but now back in. What kind of internet connection do I need to do cloud production? So for me, fastest the better, right? That's always the perfect first answer, but that's not always the case. I would say the minimum that we were doing, and we're doing camera control and also switching and multi-views return, considering you've got an upload path and a download path. Our normal operators, I asked them to have at least 10 up and 100 down. That was the minimum that we would run with. And I think that we could probably improve that requirement now, because a lot of our cable providers here in the US are probably like Comcast. Most of the lines we booked with them when we were doing the sports stuff it was a gig down or even 500 megs down and then 30 megs up. And I did notice a difference that extra little bit of speed helped a little bit more, especially with the latency and operation cameras. Where do you start, Greg, when you're starting to spec out how fast I need? Where do you want to be?
100 by 100. We don't like to entertain anything less than that, regardless of what we're doing. Even if it's just a simple stream, that's what we ask for
Well,
starters.
what about, okay, so I guess that comes back to clarify is whether we're talking remote operators,
Mhm.
distributed workflow, or are you talking from a remote site to a MCR or a master control area that
Well,
you're doing
The
switching?
stuff I'm doing, we're either 100% on site or I'm here and I've got a package out somewhere. And then it's just point to point. But yeah, regardless, I mean, we don't, because you go into, the hotel's got like 30. Well, no. Sorry, that's not going to do it, because I know that the hotel is probably splitting that 30 amongst all the guest rooms too.
Sure.
It's not dedicated 30 to the ballroom.
How much shared is out there? And the same thing for the
Right.
convention centers, right? So
Mhm.
I remember that at LVCC. It's like,
Yeah.
they're like, oh,
So,
that 10 megs, but do you really have that whole?
well,
10?
and we've also found too that, okay, great. If you, okay, we don't have 100 on site. Okay, well, great. Well, then we need to entertain another path to the internet. Do we bring somebody in? Do we get a satellite truck? Do we, microwave across the street? Because, Joe's house has got, Google Fiber. He's got a gig. There are a lot of wacky options we've tried over the years, but yeah, I mean, and all the flight packs have a couple of those ubiquity just point to point links. I mean, they're good for like 400 or 500 megs, but they'll go like 2 or 3 miles. So, a lot of times we'll find somebody that'll like give us a pipe to plug into, and yeah, it's like Granny's house. She doesn't use the internet much.
Yeah.
We literally did that once. And
Same here.
it-
Same here.
and it was a far superior connection, as hokey as it was, that the hotel provided with us
Sure.
to us. So, just any port in a storm, and as long as the client's happy and I can, conduct business. So, but yeah, we like to start asking there and see where that goes. And that kind of weeds out a lot of riffraff for us.
So from your standpoint, where you're going to do, you're working on it now, is doing remote hybrid type remote stuff from your home. What do you have there at home? I'm at
I have,
gig by gig myself for fiber redundancies here.
we have Google Fiber, which is
Okay.
symmetrical gig.
Okay.
And I just got a flyer for 2.5, and my neighbor just got a flyer for 5. He's like 4 houses down. And it's like, well, how come I didn't get the 5 notice? But I don't know if that's really gonna help. I mean, once you get to gigabit, it's like, yeah, that's a lot of bandwidth for this kind of stuff. So, unfortunately, we haven't had a whole lot of service outages out of Google. But I also have, we still have CenturyLink DSL here, and I have T-Mobile 5G, 5G modem. So we have 3 ISPs here because wifey works from home up until not too long ago. They kicked her out of the office in March of 2020, and she's been here 100% at the house for over 3 years. And they just recently started going back on a limited basis. So it's important that, when I tell somebody that I can do your, Facebook show, Zoom show, whatever, that I don't have an outage, no, I'm not, leveraging, Amazon's, excruciatingly advanced and expansive backup scenarios. But, I had to kind of do that on a smaller scale from here. I didn't want to rely on one ISP. When it goes down, where are you?
Yeah. No,
And
completely.
and the 5G stuff is pretty good. I mean, we consistently get over 100 megs up and 200 megs down, and the latency is a little high. But like in like the 80 and 90 millisecond range, and Google Fiber consistently pings it too.
Wow, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
gotta love that. And we've also, we have a Generac whole house generator here. So, and we have UPSs on the core downstairs where all the modems and main switches are. And then I've got another UPS in my office, and then another one next door in my wife's office. So, and then it only takes the Generac like 30 to 60 seconds to,
So it's
oh,
plenty of change over time.
yeah,
That-
yeah, the
that's-
mains are, the generators like waits, I think at least 20 or 30. Oh, the mains are down, and they've been down. Okay, great. Let me crank up the motor, and then it takes a little bit for the thing to stabilize, and then it chunks over the whole house. So yeah, the UPSs, we run at least 1,500 VAs. So even in here where, I have 3 4K monitors and 12 computers, I still got like 15 or 20 minutes of runtime off the battery. So I have plenty of time for the Generac to kick on and then switch over, and then the UPS goes back to no beeping mode. And but again, I know AWS takes care of a lot of this, but we still had to think about those things. What do you do, when something goes down? And if you haven't thought that through,
I think it also depends
bed.
too on how important the show is, how big the show is to what you're doing. You're more of a primary provider. The remote operators, for me, if I had a camera guy that was working out of, say, Dwayne, that was working in Lafayette, if he went down and I still had 2 other operators that were here in the office that were on redundant power and redundant internet and everything, they just take up the slack at that point. So we could move people around pretty easy. So I wasn't so stressed out about getting, though I gave him a stipend every month that he was live, and I gave him a higher bandwidth. I said, look, you call, who are they, Cox, you call Cox, get the highest that they'll give you in your location. And he did that. And I was perfectly fine paying him an extra, it was like $100 a month or something like that, just to have the fastest we can, just to not have to worry about it. But I also did the same thing, as I had a Peplink router that I sent to him, one of our company routers. I sent that to him, had him plug his internet into that. And then we had cellular backups on the backside of that. So Nate, tell me about your pathways and what you're doing for backup in your situation where I think you're in the studio right now, right? So what do you have in your place?
I'm in just my office today, but at the studio we have Verizon Fios as our main internet provider, which is fiber. The dog likes it. It's a gig up and down. Then I have Comcast over coax, which is 100, 140, something like that. The
Right.
up is not very good. And then I have that on automatic failover in case that ever goes down. And then of course I have a bunch of bonded routers and stuff laying around here that I could hook up as a last minute thing. All my machines are on UPSs and backups. And then I have a generator on site, but it's not an automated one. It's something I would have to manually plug in and start up. But as far as other failovers, I don't do as much stuff in the cloud as some of you guys, but I do a lot of vMix stuff, and we will do redundant machines here, so we could fail over to another machine in case the computer just died. So
And definitely something else to think about. True.
yeah.
To Jonas, in the work you're doing with Michael, for instance, what are you finding that most of the operators, the TDs that are dialing into those vMix machines and all, what are they clocking in as? Do we have a chart or something? Are we tracking that?
No, and I mean the bandwidth. So I'll say there's a difference between what we require, and I think that's the disconnect between you, Jeff, and Greg. Is that there's a technical requirement that we have internally that's about 10 up, 30 down. If I have that, we can do a show in the cloud because no feeds reach me. It's fine. I will not ask for that if I need that. I'll start at the I need 100. Yeah, because like Tucker
Always
messaged
ask
me
for
and
more.
brought up a great point. Is like whatever internet connection gives you the best SLA. Like for example, here where I am, I can get coax or I can get fiber from 2 different providers. Both of them support both. I can choose which transmission model I want and what provider I want, and I will treat 50 by 50 fiber over 100 by 100 coax, because here in Germany, the coax is the old infrastructure that has a lot of overselling. Coax is generally I don't know how it is in
Yeah.
the
No, it's the same way here.
US. Coax
It's a
is
shared
super
pooled
oversell.
resource. Yeah.
So I don't trust that. But like fiber is the newer infrastructure. You have the better switches, all that, and probably like when you said, "Oh yeah, we got the higher bandwidth," and suddenly the latency went down. Latency and bandwidth doesn't have anything to do with it, but to achieve the higher bandwidth, they had to put you on the newer switch. It was a little better. That was a little higher, like all that. It's interesting. I was going to Barcelona last week for ISE, and we did a remote. I did a remote cloud production from there because I wasn't here, and I was a little worried about like my network, so I brought my Peplink. I arrive at the flat and I see a big Ubiquiti Wi-Fi modem exactly above the table where I was sitting, and I did a speed test, and I was like at 300 by 300 in like this old apartment, and I'm like, great, that's like 3x what I have at home. I'll be just fine here. So yeah, it's 100 down, like 30 up. Like most residential connections should do that. That's probably what I want. And then I want to be able to say, in Germany, I have a good feeling on how reliable the internet provider are, how honest they are. Because like often that's the problem. How do you detect downtime? Because like
Sure.
we often live in this like great world of like it's either there or not. I almost never have that, but like you see increased latency, a little lower bandwidth. Like, how do you track that, and how do you actually notice that's a failure? And not like, oh, my WebRTC is weird, instance is weird. No, it's your internet. So that's like one of the points that I try to train my techs on. Like, hey, let's make sure your internet is solid. Let's make sure you know when your internet is solid and whatnot. And then Peplink
of
just
course,
brought out the
for
balance
remote
one.
techs, we're even skipping the whole point of are you plugged into the router or not, right? That's just a given.
You would
So are
hope.
you standing
You
on the
would
table,
hope.
Jonas, taking down the Ubiquiti access point and plugging directly in?
So I mean, no, and that's a great thing. Like, oh, I had a hiccup. That's really bad because the video signal, the audio signal did not get affected. My comms are on Wi-Fi on my phone or LTE anyhow. Like, I'll be honest, I don't want to live the life where I have stuff like just here and like need to be worried about power outages or something. Worst case, I can take my laptop, and the apartment I'm in actually has a local fuel cell that like jumps in if the power grid goes down, which is super unlikely here. So I was like, yeah, I'll take that redundant fiber and like power. And then the other thing that really helps us is why we have lower requirements than most single operators is we don't do shows with one person. We are
Exactly.
always
No, that's
working as a
part of it.
peer,
Yeah.
TD and engineer. The engineer is not a great TD and the TD is not a great engineer man sometimes. Most of the times we still have great people, but like they can do a show where the client will not really notice the difference as long as one of them is still alive and online. And the
Funny you
same
should say
point,
that.
like
This is true though.
the same point though, how like training that, like we do chaos testing derived from the chaos testing that Netflix does. Okay, our audio guy just left the building. We shut off his VPN. How do we make sure? Like, how often do you call? Hey, Greg, are you there? Greg? Greg, are you there? We really should be fading up that fader now. Hey, Greg. Like, when do you actually, like, we have laid out in our SOP, you do 5 calls, you do a direct call on comms. If no response, you make an all call on the production line. I am X, I'm taking over X's role. Everybody knows if they have flaky internet and they lost comms before they touch anything of their equipment. Oh, it's great. Let me just start moving faders. No, they check in. Hey, who covered for me? And we do like a spoken chain of command, like changeover. Oh, okay. You
great.
back to your controls. Because like it's so annoying if you have bad internet and then like the operator just comes online to unmute the one channel you just muted and you're like,
And that kind of comes back to something on the comm side that really comes back to is that better communication because we can't see each other. So well, usually most of the time, sometimes a lot of times they think this is comms. Don't even get me started on that path. But this is something that is different. If they're gone here, that is one advantage. If they're gone and if you're locked into we'll use Zooms as a kind of sort of comms thing, if they're gone there, they're offline. That was one thing I love about the VCOM setup that we use is if they're not logged in, and I have a habit of using it in Unity, is I always have the users up. Always, that window is always visible to me. If they're not there, then I know they've got an issue. So I could cover for them at that point in time. We know what we need to do. But yeah, we've had similar things. It's like, why are you moving that camera? Why are you moving that camera? Why are you moving that camera? I'm on the shot. I'm on the shot. And it's because they just jumped back in and didn't check in. So we've had some younger,
like active, like going over who is in command is really important,
very
especially
much
for
so.
this thing where you can't just like look over to your audio guy and you see that he hectically is like repatching in the back or like
Well,
This is
sometimes
whatever.
people shut their Unity app off because they get a text, they look at it, and then they swipe up and they just kill the app. So that happens quite often,
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
seen. I had a question. Does anybody with their redundancy of internet actually follow the cable path, like through like telephone poles that they're coming from different directions? So I had to do that for a studio I helped install because they wanted to make sure if a tree fell down, it wouldn't knock out both the primary and the backup internet.
For me, I literally could walk out my side door and see where the fiber comes out of my building, goes across the ground, it's buried, and then it goes up a squirrel infested pole into the structure that's all cable. So we're on a fiber, but it's strung like cable in the old days, and I could see my cable. It's hanging on the same pole, just so that is the part of the way. So yeah, if I took a tree back there, I'm on cellular. There's no way we get past it, and I have huge trees that are both ways that could take me out going that way or this way. So wherever the hubs happen to be, I'm done for. And it's happened with hurricanes. So yeah, there's certain times you can't help it, but
I
you have
had
to go wireless.
the beginning of the pandemic, we had a Verizon outage on our fiber, so we tried to quick change to cellular, but that was Verizon too, which was getting the same fiber at the tower. So we had to
So it didn't have any service.
we had to go up to another business and grab a Comcast line and a 300-foot cable and plug it in. But
Yeah.
we learned that lesson the hard way. So
Yeah,
Any
no,
port in a storm.
yeah. So and by the way, from experience, Starlinks don't work in a heavy storm on the side of a mountain either. So there's not always a fail safe, even if it's pointed at the sky. So and cellular doesn't work at 14,000 feet, as we found out too. So those are all things that you just live and you learn. And luckily the client was understanding, and they were, you know, they were dealing with it too, because they had trees or not trees, but lightning that had knocked down a few of their towers that they had up for scoring purposes. And so they were dealing with their own quote fires to put out. But yeah, when you're working in those situations, you just got to work with what you got to work with. And we all can do what we can do. So it is, as far as internet connections, we kind of covered that. So my open-ended question to anybody that wants to chime in, if we haven't covered it, I'll go across them again one more time. What about a latency? I heard cloud was really expensive. How much does this all cost, bandwidth and all? How do I deploy this stuff? Because it's really sounds really complicated. Are there any failover mechanisms available? And how much redundancy is there really? And then what kind of internet connection do I need to go to the cloud to be able to do cloud production? And if it's on the internet, is it secure? Can't anyone see it? So where's the number 9? What do I add in as number 9 most and biggest objections to cloud productions? Jonas, go.
Nah, I just feel like I like talking to the people that do my show, and I just want them to be here. That's what
I like to see their face. I like to see their face, but this doesn't count. Right.
Yeah, no.
So
I
I
mean,
like to
I've
see their
heard-
face on, that's an objection. I like to see their face on site.
The catering is just better on site.
Okay. You got to get a better girlfriend, man. All right.
mean-
all right, Bo, go ahead.
I'll just pipe in. One of the trucks I was on literally had a window so the producer could look the graphics guy in the eye and yell at him when he messed up.
I like to yell at the person in their
He was
face.
in the he was there was a wall between them and the truck, but he had a window put in so that he could look his graphics producer in the eye when he screamed at him.
That's awesome. All right, Greg, what's your number 9?
I guess a big thing for me is money. I mean,
Okay.
I have a plethora of computing power at my disposal. So, you know, all the vMix machines and stuff. I mean, I run on my own boxes. So why should I pay Amazon to do that?
Okay. That's understandable.
I mean, if I didn't have the hardware, I might have a different opinion, but you know, I have plenty of horsepower at my disposal. So that's my big thing. And but I can relate to the, you know, face to face with your clients and whatnot. I mean, there's a lot of I don't know what to call it, but you know, just your interaction, you know, with people you're sending invoices to, and you know, I did this big Google thing out in Monterey, offsite meeting for them, and we had Zooms for like a month up until we got on site, and the interaction between everybody was entirely different once we got there. And I don't know if it's just because, okay, now we're in show mode, or if it was just hey, you're not just a box on my computer screen. But
Sure.
people were so much nicer, and we had much deeper conversations when we got on site about a couple of things, you know. So I never underestimate that, in my opinion.
That's a good idea. Good point. All right, Nate, what about you? You because I know you play in both worlds. So what is
Yeah.
your number 1 that we haven't covered already? What's your number 1
right now,
objection?
most of the stuff I do is kind of like Greg, where I have my own vMix machines and and a lot of my stuff's hybrid, so there's always somebody on site. But I just haven't seen the POW whiz like this is so much cooler. I need to do it. Like there's nothing that just pushes me to adopt it more. There's nothing that goes, wow, this feature I have to do it because I can't do it with what I already have. So so that's pretty much where I'm at. I'm really interested in it. I'd love to mess around with stuff like this, but I haven't seen anything that's like I got to put my all into it, stop working on this stuff and really focus on this. Just haven't seen that yet.
So nothing in cloud production that's more impressive than what I could do already with hardware, software I have. That's understandable.
Exactly.
Anybody else
But
is
it's
not on
definitely
camera
the
that wants to-
future. I know that, but it's just getting dragged,
least-
kicking and
I do think like that's a valid point. Like both Greg and Nate, I love cloud because I don't have to put CapEx in. If you already put CapEx in, now you're also spending OpEx. Like that is probably the number one objection that I hear from companies. Like we already have all this stuff. That's why I love coming in when companies need to scale and we're like, and now you can scale. Because like, yeah, you're totally right. If you already have that stuff, would be a shame to have it go to waste.
Yeah, it's a good point. All right. So anybody else that's not on camera, Josh, Lenny, Guy, George, or Tucker, anybody else that want to just jump in real quick and give us anything we haven't touched on so far? That's a big objective to cloud production. Speed now for overhold piece and done. Okay. So that's going to wrap it up. We did a little longer today, but I think it was a great conversation. Jonas, thanks so much for sharing your insight. Greg, as always, and Nate, thanks for coming by and remembering, and everybody else, especially for dropping by and joining in. Next week, I am definitely going to be on site. I changed some travel plans, but next week I am going to be on site in Delray. We're still going to have the show. We're going to still do it at the same time. It will not be at Texas time. It will be at Florida time because I'll be in Florida, but it'll still happen at the same time. So 5 p.m. Central, aka Texas time. The difference is I'm going to have a friend, and I'm going to have a friend from Audinate. Will Waters is going to be our guest, and we're going to talk about some things that Audinate is doing differently, new, and all about Dante questions. Try to stump him. Bring your questions. Come in with some good ones, and yeah, it's going to be good. I can't wait. And so we're kind of divvy up the host a little bit between a couple of us. I believe I'll enlist you to help me out just in case I have a situation I need to deal with on site. So I will look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks all for coming, and we'll see you then.